Captain David Chen watched another B-17 bomber spiral into the English countryside, trailing black smoke. The fourth plane lost that week. Not to German fighters, not to flak. To something far more mundane and infinitely more frustrating. They couldn't see the enemy until it was too late. The date was March 1943, and the 8th Air Force was hemorrhaging aircraft over occupied Europe. The problem wasn't courage or skill. American bomber crews were among the bravest men in the war. The problem was contrast. Polished aluminum bombers gleaming in sunlight were visible to German fighters from 20 miles away. Meanwhile, German aircraft with mottled gray-green camouflage blended into cloud cover and haze until they were close enough to kill. Chen commanded the 351st Bombardment Squadron stationed at Polebrook, Northamptonshire. His maintenance crews worked miracles, keeping damaged aircraft flying. His armorer crews loaded bombs in darkness and rain. His flight crews launched mission after mission into the teeth of the Luftwaffe. But none of that mattered if German fighters could spot American bombers while remaining invisible themselves. The mathematics were brutal. In the past 3 months, bombers with standard polished aluminum finish had been spotted and engaged by enemy fighters in 92% of missions. Those same bombers only spotted German fighters first in 18% of engagements. The visibility asymmetry was killing men at an unsustainable rate. Chen stood on the flight line that March morning, watching ground crews prepare bombers for another raid into Germany. The aircraft gleamed like mirrors, sunlight reflecting off every surface. They were beautiful in their way. They were also death traps. In a maintenance hangar 300 yards away, Master Sergeant Raymond Kowalski was thinking the same thing. Kowalski ran the paint shop, responsible for applying squadron identification markings and nose art. Before the war, he'd been an auto body painter in Chicago, specializing in custom finishes. Now, he painted cartoon characters and pinup girls on bombers while watching them return with holes punched through. Aluminum skin, if they returned at all. Kowalski had been studying the problem for weeks. A keyed read captured German technical manuals. He'd examined downed Luftwaffe aircraft. He'd talked to British pilots who flew camouflaged Spitfires. The conclusion was obvious. Flat paint reduced visibility dramatically. Camouflage patterns, broken up aircraft silhouettes. The British had known this since 1940. The Germans had known it longer. But American bomber doctrine emphasized speed through altitude and formation flying, while camouflage was considered unnecessary weight that reduced performance. That doctrine was written before anyone understood how effective German fighters would be at exploiting visual acquisition advantage. Kowalski walked to Chun's office that afternoon without appointment or invitation. The captain looked up from paperwork as the sergeant entered. "Sir, we need to paint the bombers." Chen set down his pen. "The bombers are painted. They have squadron markings, nose art, everything required. I mean paint them completely, sir. Camouflage. Dark colors on top, light colors underneath. The way the British do it. The British fly different missions at different altitudes with different tactical requirements. The British don't lose 4 planes a week because German fighters see them from 20 miles away." Chen leaned back in his chair. He knew Kowalski's reputation. The sergeant was opinionated, technically brilliant, and completely unconcerned with telling officers things they didn't want to hear. Sergeant bomber doctrine doesn't include camouflage for good reasons. The paint adds weight. Extra weight reduces speed, ceiling, and range. Those factors affect mission performance. Sir, with respect, dead crews don't complete missions regardless of theoretical performance specifications. What are you proposing? Kowalski unrolled a sheet of paper covered with sketches and calculations. Dark olive green on upper surfaces, neutral gray on lower surfaces. Reduces visual signature by approximately 70% in typical European atmospheric conditions. Paint adds roughly 400 pounds per aircraft. Performance impact is negligible compared to combat load variations. Chen studied the drawings. The technical work was impressive. Kowalski had calculated coverage areas, paint, weights, application times, everything. But one detail was missing. Where do we get the paint? Camouflage colors aren't in the supply system for bombers. They're in the supply system for fighters, sir. P-47s use the same paint specification. Fighter groups have it warehoused. Fighter groups need it for fighters. Fighter groups have excess inventory because they over-ordered when the Thunderbolts first deployed. I checked with supply at Duxford. They've got 60 drums sitting unused. Chen recognized where this was heading. You want to requisition fighter paint for bombers without authorization. I want to prevent German fighters from spotting us while we're still forming up over the channel. Sir, that's not an answer to my question. Kowalski met his eyes. Sir, I can have 6 bombers painted in 72 hours if you authorize material acquisition. If it works, visibility reduction saves crews. If it doesn't work, I'll personally strip every aircraft back to bare aluminum. Chen thought about the 4 planes lost that week. 63 men killed or missing. Another raid was scheduled for tomorrow. More gleaming aluminum bombers would fly into Germany, visible from extreme range, targeted before they reached their objectives. I can't authorize using fighter paint for bombers. That's outside my authority. Understood, sir. However, I also can't monitor every supply transaction my maintenance section conducts. Kowalski understood perfectly. Don't ask permission. Don't tell me details. Just make it happen. Yes, sir. My crew will conduct routine supply coordination with fighter groups in the area. See that you. Kowalski left the office and gathered his paint crew. 7 men, all former civilian painters or automotive technicians. He explained the situation quickly. We need 60 drums of camouflage paint from Duxford Fighter Base. They have excess inventory. We don't have authorization to take it. But 6 bombers need to be painted before tomorrow's mission. His assistant crew chief, Corporal Mike Sullivan, asked the obvious question. Are we stealing paint from fighter jockeys? We're reallocating underutilized resources to critical operational requirements. That's definitely stealing. It's tactical adaptation. There's a difference. What happens when Fighter Command notices 60 drums missing? They won't notice for weeks. Their inventory system is backlogged. By the time anyone asks questions, we'll have proven the concept works. Sullivan grinned. When do we leave? 2100 hours. Bring a truck. The fighter base at Duxford was 15 miles south. Kowalski drove with 2 crew members in a requisitioned supply truck. The base was busy with evening maintenance operations. P-47 Thunderbolts lined the flight line, their own modeled camouflage paint barely visible in the darkness. The paint storage facility was a converted barn on the base perimeter. Kowalski had scouted it 3 days earlier during a legitimate supply coordination visit. The building held thousands of gallons of various paints, primers, and coatings. 60 drums of camouflage paint represented less than 5% of inventory. The door was locked, but not guarded. Fighter Command considered paint low-priority supply. Nobody expected theft. Kowalski picked the lock with tools borrowed from the locksmith shop. Inside, drums were stacked floor to ceiling, each marked with technical specifications and color codes. He found the camouflage section quickly. Olive drab, neutral gray, and flat black. Exactly what he needed. Load 60 drums. 30 olive, 20 gray, 10 black. Move fast. The work took 40 minutes. Drums were heavy, roughly 400 pounds each. They rolled them on hand trucks from the barn to the truck bed, trying to minimize noise. Every few minutes, someone would check for approaching security patrols. By 2200 hours, the truck was loaded. Kowalski locked the barn door behind them and drove back to Polbrook at exactly the speed limit. The cargo was conspicuous, but plausible. Supply trucks moved between bases constantly. They reached Polbrook at 2300 hours and unloaded directly into the paint shop. 60 drums disappearing into the maintenance hangar like they'd always been there. Sullivan counted the inventory. We just stole 24,000 pounds of paint. Borrowed, Kowalski corrected. If this works, Fighter Command will understand. And if it doesn't, then I'm getting court-martialed for the stupidest theft in military history. The next morning, Kowalski selected 6 bombers for the initial test, aircraft that were already scheduled for routine maintenance, giving him legitimate reason to have them in the hangar. He briefed his paint crews on the application pattern. British camouflage doctrine uses dark colors on upper surfaces to blend against ground when viewed from above. Light colors on lower surfaces to blend against sky when viewed from below. We're adapting that for high-altitude bomber operations. He showed them reference photographs from captured German aircraft and British bombers. The patterns were irregular, organic shapes that broke up the aircraft's outline. We're not trying to make these planes invisible. We're trying to reduce acquisition range. If German fighters spot us at 10 miles instead of 20, that's a significant tactical advantage. The actual painting was intensive labor. Each bomber had roughly 12,000 square feet of external surface area. The crew worked in sections, applying paint with spray equipment borrowed from the motor pool. They started with olive drab on wings and fuselage upper surfaces, followed by neutral gray on undersides. The work required precision. Uneven application would create weight imbalances affecting flight characteristics. They masked off squadron markings, serial numbers, and nose art that couldn't be covered. The paint itself was designed for quick drying in field conditions, curing in approximately 4 hours under normal temperature. Captain Chen appeared in the hangar at 1400 hours. He walked slowly around the first completed bomber, studying the transformation. The gleaming aluminum was gone, replaced by mottled patterns that made the aircraft fade into visual background. How much weight did this add? Approximately 380 pounds, sir, well within acceptable limits for performance variation. How long until all 6 are finished? 18 hours, sir. They'll be ready for tomorrow's mission. Chen nodded slowly. Group Command is going to notice 6 camouflaged bombers. Yes, sir. I expect questions. What will you tell them? That visibility reduction was necessary for crew survival and that I take full responsibility for unauthorized material procurement. You're betting your career on paint. I'm betting 63 lives weren't wasted learning the wrong lesson. Sir, by 0600 hours the next morning, all 6 bombers were painted, dried, and flight ready. The ground crews towed them to the flight line alongside 30 other polished aluminum aircraft. The contrast was striking. The camouflaged planes looked purposeful, aggressive, almost predatory. The bare metal planes looked vulnerable. Colonel Marcus Webb, Group Commander, noticed immediately. He walked the flight line during pre-flight inspection, stopping at each painted aircraft. Captain Chen explained these modifications. Experimental camouflage, sir, designed to reduce visual acquisition range. Authorized by whom? My initiative, sir. Master Sergeant Kowalski developed the application protocol. Webb studied the nearest bomber. This paint wasn't in our supply inventory. No, sir. We acquired it through coordination with fighter groups. Coordination or appropriation. Chen chose his words carefully. The paint came from excess fighter inventory, sir. The transfer was informal. Informal meaning unauthorized. Yes, sir. Webb was silent for a long moment. Around them, flight crews were conducting pre-flight checks. Engines were starting, filling the morning air with thunder. These aircraft are scheduled for today's mission to Wilhelmshaven. Deep penetration, expected heavy fighter opposition. Webb looked at Chen. Your camouflaged planes will fly lead formation. We'll see if paint makes any difference when the Luftwaffe shows up. The mission briefing was routine. Target: submarine pens at Wilhelmshaven. Route north across the North Sea, turn southeast into Germany. Bomb, egress, northwest back to England. Expected opposition: heavy. Intelligence estimated 60 to 80 German fighters would intercept. The 6 camouflaged bombers took off in the lead formation. Behind them, 32 polished aluminum aircraft formed up. The contrast was visible even from the ground. The painted planes seemed to absorb light. The bare metal planes reflected it like mirrors. Lieutenant James Morrison piloted one of the camouflaged aircraft. His bomber, named Silent Thunder, had been the first painted. Morrison was skeptical about the whole concept. Paint wasn't armor. It wouldn't stop bullets. But he'd also watched too many friends get shot down by fighters they never saw coming. The formation climbed to 25,000 feet and turned toward Germany. The visibility was excellent, clear skies with scattered clouds. Perfect conditions for German fighters to spot them. Morrison scanned constantly, looking for the enemy. His crew did the same, gunners tracking their sectors, watching for the distinctive shapes of Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf fighters. At 90 miles from target, the tail gunner called out, "Bandits, 6 o'clock high, looks like a dozen plus." German fighters diving from altitude, their preferred attack pattern. Morrison tightened formation, maintaining position with the other bombers. The fighters closed rapidly, becoming identifiable. Messerschmitt 19s and Focke-Wulf 190s, mixed formations. But something was different. The German fighters seemed hesitant, making shallower approaches than usual. Morrison watched them circle, reposition, approach again. They were having trouble tracking targets. His co-pilot noticed it too. "They keep losing us in the haze." "Watch them. They line up for an attack run, then break off like they lost visual." It was true. The German fighters were executing attack patterns, but their gunnery was terrible. Shots were going wide, missing by large margins. The pilots seemed to be struggling with range estimation. Meanwhile, the polished aluminum bombers behind Morrison's formation were taking heavy fire. German fighters ignored the lead camouflaged planes and focused on the shiny targets they could see clearly. The pattern repeated throughout the mission. German fighters engaged aggressively against bare metal bombers while seeming confused by the camouflaged aircraft. Morrison's formation took minimal damage. The aluminum planes behind them absorbed the majority of fighter attention. The bombing run over Wilhelmshaven was successful. All 6 camouflaged bombers released their payloads and turned for home. Behind them, 3 aluminum bombers were going down, crews bailing out over enemy territory. The return flight showed the same pattern. German fighters spotted and engaged the aluminum bombers while the camouflaged planes flew relatively unmolested. It wasn't that the painted aircraft were invisible, but they were harder to acquire, harder to track, harder to hit. Morrison landed at Polbrook with minor damage. 2 small caliber hits in the tail section, easily repaired. His bomber had flown through the same airspace, the same fighter opposition, the same tactical environment as the planes that didn't come home. The only difference was paint. The debriefing was intense. Flight crews reported their observations. Gunnery officers analyzed engagement patterns. Intelligence compiled data from all 38 bombers that flew the mission. The statistics were undeniable. Camouflaged bombers, 6 deployed, 6 returned, total damage minor. Aluminum bombers, 32 deployed, 29 returned, 3 lost, 7 with major damage. Colonel Webb listened to the reports without expression. When the briefing concluded, he called Captain Chen and Sergeant Kowalski to his office. "Sergeant, your unauthorized paint job just saved lives." "Yes, sir. It also violated supply regulations, procurement procedures, and chain of command protocol." "Yes, sir." "Fighter Command is already asking questions about missing paint inventory. They're going to trace it here." "I expect so, sir." Webb walked to his window, looking out at the flight line where ground crews were already examining the returned bombers. Every squadron commander in 8th Air Force is going to want this treatment for their aircraft. "We don't have authorization, we don't have supply allocation, and we definitely don't have enough stolen paint for 200 bombers." "No, sir," Kowalski agreed. "But we proved the concept works. That's going to create pressure for official adoption." "That was the intention, sir." Webb turned around. "You created a crisis to force policy change. I solved a visibility problem that was killing crews." "Sir, by stealing from fighter groups, by demonstrating that a simple modification could dramatically improve survival. Rates Webb studied the sergeant for a long moment. "You're either going to get court-martialed or commended." "I'm not sure which. As long as fewer crews die, sir, I can accept either outcome." The colonel almost smiled. "Write a comprehensive technical report. Include everything: paint specifications, application procedures, weight analysis, performance impact, and mission effectiveness data. Make it detailed enough that any maintenance crew could replicate your work." "Yes, sir. May I ask why?" "Because I'm sending your report to 8th Air Force Headquarters with a recommendation that camouflage becomes standard for all bomber operations." Within a week, Kowalski's report reached the desk of Major General Ira Eaker, commanding 8th Air Force. Eaker read it alongside mission reports from multiple bomber groups, all showing similar patterns. Camouflaged aircraft suffered lower casualty rates and received less fighter attention than bare metal aircraft. The technical objections that had prevented earlier camouflage adoption seemed trivial compared to the survival data. Yes, paint added weight. Yes, it reduced speed marginally. But none of that mattered if crews lived through missions that would have killed them in polished aluminum aircraft. Eaker issued a directive in April 1943. All 8th Air Force bombers would receive camouflage paint. The specification followed Kowalski's recommendations exactly. Olive drab on upper surfaces, neutral gray underneath, applied in irregular patterns to break up aircraft outline. The logistics were massive. Over 500 bombers required painting. The supply system, which had no camouflage paint allocated for bombers, suddenly needed hundreds of thousands of gallons. Procurement contracts were expedited. Paint manufacturers ramped production. Fighter paint inventories were formally redirected to bomber requirements. The transformation took 3 months. By July 1943, the gleaming aluminum bomber formations were gone, replaced by mottled gray-green aircraft that faded into European skies. The casualty statistics told the story. In March 1943, before camouflage adoption, the 8th Air Force lost an average of 6 bombers per mission. By August 1943, after full camouflage implementation, losses had dropped to 3 per mission. Same targets, same opposition, same tactics. The only variable was paint. Fighter Command eventually discovered that 60 drums of paint had disappeared from Duxford. The investigation traced the missing inventory to Polbrook and ultimately to Sergeant Kowalski. The official response came in the form of a memo stating that fighter paint had been appropriately reallocated to higher priority operations. No charges were filed. Kowalski never received official recognition. His name didn't appear in reports to higher headquarters. The camouflage initiative was attributed to field innovations by 8th Air Force maintenance personnel. But everyone in the bomber groups knew who had started it. The sergeant who stole the sky. The British found the whole situation amusing. They'd been trying to convince Americans to adopt camouflage since 1942, offering technical specifications and application protocols. The Americans had politely declined, citing performance concerns. Now, American bombers were painted according to British specifications, implemented not through official channels, but through unauthorized supply raids and determined sergeants. The innovation spread beyond bombers. Transport aircraft received camouflage. Reconnaissance planes got specialized patterns optimized for their mission profiles. Even some fighter groups adopted modified schemes after seeing the bomber results. By 1944, camouflage was so standard that new aircraft rolled off American production lines already painted. The factories incorporated it into manufacturing processes. What had started as an unauthorized modification became fundamental design specification. The German response was interesting. Luftwaffe intelligence analyzed the change, concluding that American bomber crews had finally learned lessons the Germans had known since the Spanish Civil War. Visibility management was critical to survival. The fact that Americans had to steal paint to implement the solution suggested. To German analysts, that American military bureaucracy was still struggling with tactical adaptation. They weren't entirely wrong. After the war, Kowalski returned to Chicago and opened an auto body shop. He specialized in custom paint jobs, building a reputation for quality work. He never advertised his wartime service. Occasionally, veterans would recognize his name and ask if he was the Kowalski who'd painted bombers. He'd nod and change the subject. He died in 1978. His obituary mentioned military service, but nothing specific. His family found, among his possessions, a faded photograph of 6 B-17 bombers in fresh camouflage paint, lined up on a March morning in England. On the back, someone had written, "The day we stopped shining." Captain Chen survived the war, flying missions until Germany surrendered. He later wrote a memoir that included a chapter about the camouflage initiative. He was careful to credit Kowalski by name and detailed the sergeant's technical work. The memoir was published in 1989 to minimal attention, but it preserved the story of how paint changed bomber warfare. The broader lesson took decades to be fully understood. Military innovation often comes from ground level, from people directly facing problems who understand solutions instinctively. The challenge is creating systems that encourage rather than punish that innovation. Kowalski's unauthorized paint raid violated multiple regulations. In a different context, under different leadership, he would have faced court-martial. But Captain Chen and Colonel Webb recognized that survival mattered more than procedure. They protected Kowalski, enabled his work, and pushed his innovation up through channels that eventually transformed it into doctrine. Modern military innovation programs reference the bomber camouflage story as an example of effective bottom-up adaptation. The rapid prototyping, field testing, and data-driven validation became models for how tactical improvements should be developed. The fact that it started with theft is usually downplayed in official accounts. The strategic impact was significant. Reduced bomber losses meant more aircraft available for missions. More aircraft meant more bombs delivered. More bombs delivered meant faster degradation of German industrial capacity. Camouflage paint indirectly shortened the war. Quantifying exactly how much is impossible. But the survival statistics are clear. Thousands of bomber crew members flew missions in camouflaged aircraft who would have died in polished aluminum planes. Those crews completed missions, dropped bombs, and came home. Their survival contributed to Allied victory in ways that extended far beyond simple casualty numbers. Kowalski understood something fundamental. Tactical problems require tactical solutions, not strategic planning. The bureaucracy would eventually catch up, develop proper procurement channels, establish official specifications. But crews were dying immediately, and immediate problems demanded immediate action. His solution was theft. Not elaborate or sophisticated theft, just taking what was needed from people who weren't using it. The moral calculation was simple. Fighter groups had excess paint. Bomber groups needed paint. Crews were dying. Any system that couldn't reallocate resources quickly enough to prevent deaths was a system that deserved to be circumvented. The fact that he was right didn't make the theft legal. It made it necessary. There's a difference, though military justice doesn't always recognize it. Kowalski was fortunate that his commanders did. The 6 bombers he painted that March became symbols throughout 8th Air Force. Other squadrons would request Polebrook maintenance crews to advise on camouflage application. Kowalski's paint shop became, briefly, the center of tactical innovation for an entire Air Force. He never seemed impressed by the attention. When other sergeants asked for his secret, he'd shrug and say, "Paint the planes so the enemy can't see them." It's not complicated. But it was complicated in all the ways that matter in military organizations. Identifying the problem required observation and analysis. Developing the solution required technical expertise. Implementing the solution required willingness to break rules. Proving the solution required putting lives at risk. And sustaining the solution required navigating bureaucracy that resisted change. Kowalski did all of that. Not because he was seeking recognition or advancement. It's because watching men die from a preventable problem was unacceptable. The B-17 bombers of World War II are remembered for many things: their defensive armament, their bomb capacity, their role in strategic bombing campaign. They should also be remembered for teaching a simple lesson. Sometimes the most important innovations come from sergeants who refuse to accept that following. Regulations is more important than saving lives. The men who flew in camouflaged bombers never knew the full story. They didn't know their aircraft were painted with stolen materials. They didn't know a sergeant had risked court-martial to protect them. They just knew they came home when others didn't, that German fighters seemed to have trouble spotting them, that the odds of survival had shifted slightly but significantly in their favor. That was enough. That was everything. Raymond Kowalski stole 60 drums of paint and changed bomber warfare. He did it without authorization, without permission, without concern for regulations that valued procedure over survival. He proved that tactical innovation doesn't require elaborate systems or official approval. Sometimes it just requires paint, determination, and the understanding that saving lives matters more than following rules. The sky he stole wasn't literal. It was the visual advantage that German fighters had exploited for months. By painting bombers to blend into that sky, Kowalski took away the enemy's greatest tactical asset and gave it to the crews who needed it most. That's the real story. Not the theft itself, but what the theft represented. A refusal to accept unnecessary death, a commitment to tactical adaptation, and the understanding that sometimes the only way to save lives is to break every rule that prevents you from doing what's necessary. The gleaming aluminum bombers are gone now. The ones that survived the war were scrapped or put in museums, but the lesson remains. Preserved not in official histories, but in the understanding that innovation often begins with someone who sees a problem clearly, knows the solution instinctively, and refuses to let regulations prevent them from acting. Raymond Kowalski saw men dying because German fighters could see them first. He knew paint would fix it. And when the system said it couldn't provide paint quickly enough, he stole it and proved the system wrong. That's not just military history. That's how change happens when survival is on the line.